Early spring in Portland always carried a kind of fragile beauty raindrops on budding branches. The scent of wet cedar drifting through the open kitchen window. I had spent the afternoon preparing the kind of Sunday dinner I thought still mattered. Rosemary roast chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and the lemon tart. Ilara loved since she was little. Patrick set the table while I arranged the serving dishes, taking a small comfort in the weight of the silverware against the old oak. When Ilara and Dorian arrived, I noticed it immediately. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Dorian filled the air with small talk about traffic on the bridge, but she kept glancing at her phone, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Patrick tried to draw her into conversation, but she responded with clipped phrases. Like every word cost more than she could afford, we took our seats. And for a while, I let the rhythm of the meal carry us. Plates passed, glasses clinked, the faint hum of rain against the window pane. I asked about her week, the project she was leading at work. She nodded, offered a few polite sentences, then turned her gaze down to her plate. It was halfway through the meal, just as I was pouring gravy over Patrick's potatoes, that it happened. Ilara set down her fork, the sound sharp against the china, and looked directly at me. Her voice was steady, almost casual, but her words cut clean through the air. "Because it's your house," she said. "But not because you're welcome." The room seemed to shrink. Patrick froze, the knife in his hand suspended over the chicken. Dorian reached for his water glass, his eyes fixed on the table. I felt the warmth drain from my face, replaced by something cold and tight in my chest. No one moved. No one spoke. The rain outside filled the silence like static. I swallowed, tried to muster a question, but the words stuck. Instead, I slid the serving spoon back into the dish, my fingers trembling just enough for me to notice. We finished the meal in fragments of conversation, none of them about what had just been said. I cleared the plates in silence, stacking them neatly in the sink, the scent of lemon and sugar from the untouched tart clinging to the air. When the door closed behind them, the house felt heavier. Patrick lingered in the kitchen, his mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again. I knew the night would be long. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint glow from the street lamp outside slicing across the room. Every time I closed my eyes, her words came back measured, deliberate, as if she had rehearsed them. "Because it's your house, but not because you're welcome." I thought of the little girl who used to curl up beside me on the couch, falling asleep with her head on my lap. The girl I raised alone after losing my first husband, Ian, to a sudden heart attack. I had worked nights at the diner, sold my grandmother's sapphire ring, and skipped meals so I could keep her in the private school she loved. Every sacrifice felt worth it, because it was for her. Beside me, Patrick shifted, sensing I was awake. "Maeve," he murmured, "don't let what she said get under your skin. You know how tense she's been lately." I turned to face him in the dark. Tense is one thing. Patrick, that was something else. He hesitated, his breathing just uneven enough to tell me there was more he could say. Maybe she just... No, I interrupted. She meant it. And she meant me to hear it exactly that way. Patrick reached for my hand, but I pulled the covers closer to my chest. I could feel there was something he wasn't telling me. Years of running a household alone had taught me to read the smallest shifts in tone, the pauses that hold more weight than the words. I lay awake long after he drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. The rain had stopped, leaving a hollow quiet that made my thoughts louder. Ilara had said it with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from a passing mood. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. Whatever she meant about things changing, I would find out. And I would hear it from her, without anyone else in the room, the next morning. I found Patrick in the kitchen, pouring coffee into his favorite chipped mug. The smell was warm and familiar, but it did nothing to steady the unease that had followed me from the night before. I sat at the table, hands wrapped around my own cup, and waited until he looked at me. "We're not going to pretend last night didn't happen," I said. He exhaled slowly, setting the pot back on the burner. "Maeve, maybe she just—" "No, don't soften it." She meant every word. I leaned forward. "And I think you know more than you're telling me." Patrick's gaze shifted toward the window. That small movement told me enough he was deciding how much to admit. "A few weeks ago," he began, "Ilara came by while you were out. She wanted to talk about the future." I kept my voice even. "What future?" She said it might be smart to transfer the deed to the house now. That way, if anything ever happened, there wouldn't be complications. My fingers tightened around the mug. "Transfer the deed while I'm still alive and well?" She framed it as a precaution. "Maeve, for your own good." I felt the sting of the words more than the heat of the coffee. "And you didn't think to mention this before I didn't want to upset you," he said quietly. Upset didn't begin to cover it. The house wasn't just wood and nails, it was the place I had poured years into restoring. The place where I thought family meant safety. Hearing that my daughter had been discussing its future without me felt like the floor shifting under my feet. Patrick reached for my hand, but I pulled back. His silence these past weeks had allowed something to grow in the dark. And now I needed to see exactly what it was. That afternoon, I called Ren, an old friend who had known Ilara since she was in pigtails. Ren had a way of hearing things, partly because she worked at the local cafe where half the neighborhood seemed to pass through each week. We met there, tucked into a corner booth. She slid a steaming mug toward me before I could even order. "You look like you've been carrying bricks around," she said. "It's Ilara," I admitted, stirring my coffee. "Something's going on. Patrick told me she's been talking about transferring the deed to the house. I need to know if you've heard anything." Ren's brows knit together, and she leaned in. "I didn't want to bring this up unless you asked. But, yes, I've heard things. Mostly from Dorian." I set the spoon down, my pulse ticking faster. "What kind of things?" She lowered her voice. "He was in here last week with one of his friends. I wasn't listening on purpose, but they weren't exactly being quiet. He mentioned they were in a tight spot after some investment went sideways. Something about a project in Bend commercial real estate. I think that didn't pan out. Lost a big chunk of money." I kept my face still, but my stomach turned. Ren continued. Then he said, and I'm quoting here, "Once we have the house sorted, we can fix the cash flow." The words landed heavy between us. "Sorted," I repeated slowly. "He used that word." She nodded, like it was already a plan in motion. I sat back, feeling the air shift around me. Patrick's version had been about future planning, all wrapped in concern and caution. But this was about plugging a financial hole, and my home wasn't a safety net for them. It was mine. "They've been coming at this from two angles," I said quietly. Ilara with the emotional pitch, Dorian with the financial motive. Ren's eyes softened. "Maeve, you need to protect yourself. Whatever they're planning, it's not about your comfort." I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into my fingers, grounding me. Ren didn't need to tell me twice. I already knew my next step would have to be deliberate and quiet enough that they wouldn't see it coming. The next morning, I waited until Patrick left for his volunteer shift at the community garden before opening my laptop. I told myself I was just being cautious, but my hands moved with a certainty that didn't feel new. I logged into my bank accounts first. Everything looked normal at a glance. But when I dug deeper into the account activity, two notations caught my eye. Information request processed, one from 3 weeks ago, another just last Friday. I hadn't made those requests, and the idea that someone else had sent them in my name tightened the back of my neck. I moved on to the property records portal for Multnomah County. Buried in the recent activity section, I saw another request, a copy of the full deed to my house. No reason was listed. Just the date, the same Friday as the second bank inquiry. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. That was the same afternoon Alara had dropped by while I was at my book club. She'd left a note on the counter about bringing me muffins, which I'd found odd at the time because she'd never baked in her life. I closed the laptop and went into the study. Patrick's desk was a neat man's space papers stacked in perfect squares. Pens aligned. I opened the top drawer, thinking I'd find nothing. Instead, a business card sat alone in the corner. The name read Edwin C., Marchant, attorney at law, elder, and disability rights. It wasn't Patrick's attorney. I knew the man he used for his will. And this wasn't him. I turned the card over. In small, neat handwriting that I recognized as Patrick's was a phone number and the words, "Call Recapacity Planning." Capacity. The word echoed in my head. This wasn't just about the house. They were looking into my legal competence, guardianship, control. I placed the card back exactly where I'd found it, straightened the pens, and closed the drawer. If Patrick or Alara were already moving pieces, I couldn't let them know I'd seen the board. Back at the kitchen table, I sipped the coffee I'd left growing cold. The rain had started again, steady against the roof, masking the quiet in the house in that sound. I made myself a promise, whatever they were planning, I would know every detail before they made their next move. I didn't waste time. By mid-morning, I was in Jonas Rourke's office, the familiar scent of leather and paper grounding me. Jonas had handled the sale of my late husband's business years ago and earned my trust with his quiet, methodical way of working. I laid it all out: Alara's remark at dinner, Patrick's admission, Wren's overheard conversation, the unauthorized requests for my records, and the elder law attorney's card in Patrick's desk. Jonas listened without interrupting, jotting notes in his precise, blocky handwriting. When I finished, he leaned back. "Maeve, this isn't something you take on piecemeal. You need two things immediately: asset protection and documented proof of your mental capacity." He explained the options: placing my home and financial accounts into a revocable trust under my sole control, updating my power of attorney so no one could make decisions without my explicit consent, and obtaining a notarized medical evaluation to certify my competency. Once those are in place, they can talk all they want about guardianship. But it won't hold water, he said. I asked about confronting them now. Jonas shook his head. Not yet. If you tip your hand before you have the evidence, they'll adjust their strategy. Let them believe you're unaware. After I left his office, I sat in my car for a long moment before pulling out my phone. I called Sylvie, my cousin in Vermont. She'd worked as a probate clerk for 30 years and had seen families torn apart over far less than a house. When I told her what was happening, she didn't sound surprised. Guardianship laws are meant to protect people, Maeve. But I've seen them used to strip someone of everything. All it takes is a cooperative doctor and a judge who doesn't ask too many questions. The knot in my chest tightened. I can keep an eye on court filings in your county, Sylvie offered. If they move to file anything, you'll know before it's official. I thanked her, feeling the smallest flicker of relief. Between Jonas's legal shield and Sylvie's watchful eye, I was no longer completely alone in this. Still, the question pressed at me if they were already laying the groundwork. How much longer before they made their move 2 days later? I called Alara and invited her over for coffee. I made sure to keep my voice light, the kind of casual tone a mother might use when trying to smooth over a tense evening. She agreed without hesitation, and by the time she arrived, The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and fresh brew. I'd already placed my phone on the counter, angled just so. The recording app running silently. I told myself it was only a precaution. But my heart knew better. We made small talk at first, her work. The weather. A new Thai place she and Dorian had tried. Then I eased us toward the topic I wanted. You know, Patrick mentioned you'd been thinking about the future, I said, wrapping my hands around my mug. What exactly did you have in mind? Her shoulders relaxed, as if she'd been waiting for me to bring it up. It's really about streamlining. Mom, you've got a lot of accounts, and the house well. It might make sense to put it in my name now. That way, everything's simple later on. I tilted my head, keeping my tone warm. Simple for who, for everyone. She said quickly, it's just, you never know what can happen, and this would avoid all that messy probate stuff. It's the smart thing to do. I nodded slowly, as if considering it, and how would we even start something like that? She smiled, leaning in. Dorian's already talked to someone about the deed. He said it's just a few papers to sign. No big deal. Inside, a cold clarity settled over me. Outwardly, I took a sip of coffee. It sounds like you've given this a lot of thought. I have, she said, her voice carrying that mix of persuasion and certainty she'd used as a teenager when she wanted her way. It's all about making things easier down the road. I let her keep talking, asking gentle, open questions. Each answer captured on the device beside me. She believed she was pulling me closer to her plan. In reality, every word was a brick in the wall I was building between us. The morning after my talk with Ilara, I sat in Jonas Rourke's office again, the recording from my phone playing softly between us. He didn't say much until it ended, then gave a small, decisive nod. This is enough to justify taking action now. By noon, I had signed the documents to place my home, bank accounts, and investments into a living trust, one with me as the sole trustee and no successor named. Jonas filed everything quietly. The paperwork routed through his most discreet paralegal. No one outside this office needs to know, he said. From there, I went to my doctor's clinic. Dr. Lerner had treated me for over a decade, and he didn't hesitate when I asked for a full cognitive evaluation. We went through memory exercises, reasoning tests, and problem-solving scenarios. An hour later, he signed the notarized statement himself, affirming my mental capacity in unambiguous terms. I folded the document into my bag like it was body armor. That afternoon, I made one more stop, this one outside the bounds of legal paperwork. I called Frank Daly, an old acquaintance from the Chamber of Commerce who now dealt in commercial loans. He also happened to be one of Dorian's creditors. When he answered, I kept my tone cordial. Frank, I hear you've got some exposure with Dorian in that Bend project. A pause. I do. Why, I thought you should know, I said evenly, that whatever he's counting on from me isn't going to happen. My assets are now legally out of reach. I wouldn't want you making any plans based on promises he can't keep. Frank exhaled slowly. That's good to know. Very good to know. I ended the call knowing the message would land exactly where I wanted it to. By the time I returned home, the trust was filed, my capacity certified, and a ripple of doubt had been planted in Dorian's camp. The board was set differently now, and the next move was theirs. The next morning was unusually still. I was rinsing out my coffee cup when Patrick, standing by the front window, said quietly, Ilara's here. I looked up. Her car was parked across the street. Engine off, but she wasn't getting out. She sat there for several minutes, head bent toward her phone, before finally starting the car again and driving away without knocking. 2 hours later, my phone rang. Her name lit up the screen. I let it buzz twice before answering. Mom. Her voice cracked, thick with tears. Mom? What did you do? I kept my tone level. I just made sure no one could make decisions for me without my consent. There was a beat of silence. Then a sharp inhale. It's not like that. This is all a misunderstanding. We just wanted to. I've heard what you wanted, I said evenly. And I've protected myself. That's all there is to it. Her breath hitched, the sobs catching in her throat. You're twisting everything. Dorian and I were trying to help. Why won't you even give us a chance to explain? I've heard the explanations. Ilara. My voice softened just enough to take the sting out of the words. But I didn't yield. Some things can't be smoothed over with a talk. She started to say something else, but I pressed the end call button before the conversation could circle back into persuasion and excuses. The kitchen was quiet again. Patrick was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I set the phone down, poured the rest of my coffee into the sink, and began loading the dishwasher. The trust was in place. The evaluations were filed. The line had been drawn. Now, whether she understood it or not, the rules between us had changed for good. In the weeks that followed, the air in the house shifted. The tension that had hung in every corner eased. Not because the problem had disappeared, but because I had drawn a line that wasn't going to be crossed. Ilara still called from time to time, her tone careful, her words chosen with precision. I didn't shut her out, but I no longer left the door wide open for her to walk through on her own terms. Patrick, after a few quiet days of distance, began to speak more openly one evening over dinner. He admitted, I should have told you sooner. I thought I was avoiding a fight, but I see now I was letting something grow in the dark. It wasn't an excuse, but it was an acknowledgement I'd been waiting for. Since then, he's made a point of standing beside me, not in the middle. My own days began to feel different. I started meeting Ren for morning walks, letting the damp spring air clear my head. I signed up for a pottery class, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. I met with Jonas not just to talk about protecting what I had, but about how I wanted to use it for travel, for small projects, for living on my terms. The house felt lighter, though it was the same wood and plaster it had always been. Every creak of the floorboards, every breeze through the kitchen window reminded me that I'd not only kept these walls, but the life inside them was mine to shape. I hadn't set out to wage a battle. I had simply refused to surrender. In the end, I didn't just keep my home. I reclaimed the authority I hadn't realized I'd begun to give away. And in doing so, I found a version of myself I didn't want to lose again.